Life can be totally unpredictable. Who could have seen it coming way back at the beginning of last year? Who could have seen this pandemic coming? Didn't it feel like we were living in a movie when it first started? Who could have seen all that coming? It was very unpredictable. And who could have predicted at this time last year that the Taliban would be in complete control of Afghanistan now? Who saw that coming? And who could have predicted that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau would be governing with a minority government at this time? Well, maybe some things are predictable, but there are a lot of things throughout the history of the world that are very unpredictable, and there are a lot of things in our stories, in our own lives, that can be very unpredictable and chaotic, and we didn't see it coming. And not only did we not predict it, we never could have. It was just a new beginning. All these new beginnings that we may face in life, new beginnings that our world faces, new beginnings that we might face in our own lives, they may be so unpredictable. Well, there's somebody in the Bible who faced things that were unpredictable. And when Joseph was with his family, working the farm, when Joseph was with family, could he have predicted that he would be sold into slavery? And then once Joseph is in slavery and he's a servant in Potiphar's house, could he have predicted that things would actually get worse and he would end up in jail? And when Joseph's sitting in jail, could he see it coming? Could he have predicted that he would actually be the administrator over all of Egypt? These were things that were totally unpredictable for Joseph. And yet there's something about these stories about Joseph that will teach us about how to live through unpredictable times and unpredictable lives. So what is it? Let's take a look at it, and let's see that there's actually something consistent about all that's happening when we look at Joseph and how he went from being in a farm to being in slavery, from being in slavery to being in jail, from being in jail to being an administrator over Egypt. There's actually something that's very much steadfast and in common throughout all that time. And what is it? There's so much unpredictable there, but there's also something that's very predictable. Do you know what it is? Now you might be thinking, God. Well, yes, we certainly could preach a sermon on that. But actually, let's take a moment to think about how Joseph himself is predictable. Joseph himself is very predictable through it all. He's very predictable in that he has the same gifts from God right through. His ability to dream and interpret dreams, that's a special gift from God. And some people have special gifts from God, and it's unique to them. But that's something unique to Joseph, and it stayed with him. That's consistent, God's gift. Do we know that God's gifts are consistent in our lives? What about his gift of administration? He's just good at doing that kind of thing. That's consistent. Joseph in that would be very predictable. He was good at managing Potiphar's house. He was good at managing the jail. He'd be good at managing the whole nation. He's very predictable. What gifts has God given to us in these talents that we're able to serve others? How are we predictable? Here's another thing that's predictable about Joseph, and here we refer to God here, that God's presence was with Joseph. Joseph constantly sought God's presence. He lived life with constant reference to God, and in fact, he had God's Spirit upon him. Let's take a look at a few verses to see that. Genesis 39:2, when he's in Potiphar's home. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. The Lord was with him. Verse 21, now he's in the jail. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. There again, the Lord was with him, God's presence with him. And how about when he's standing before Pharaoh? Well, here's what Pharaoh has to say. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God? There's again something that is very consistent about Joseph himself. Despite all that's inconsistent and chaotic around him, he himself is very predictable in that he looked to Joseph and you'll see God's presence there. What about us? Could that be said of us? Are we predictable that no matter what's happening around us, people will say, God's presence is upon you and upon me? So Joseph himself was very predictable in unpredictable times. And in that is actually quite godly, in that God himself is predictable. And you realize I'm meaning predictable in a good way. And how is God predictable? Well, we can see that just looking back to the Old Testament to begin with. We see God's covenant promises, and God is always faithful to his promises, and that becomes very predictable. And we see this especially played out through God's relationship with his people. The people of the Old Testament that we read about, Israel and Judah, God, they are predictable, and they're predictable in a bad way. They're constantly rebellion, constant grumbling, constant falling away, constant seeking other gods. Yet God is predictable in that he's always making it possible. He's always making a way, even when they're running away, he's making a way that he can keep his promises, his covenant promises to be their people, that he will be their God, and that through them, all the nations will be blessed ultimately, as he promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 that we looked at last week. God is predictable in how he keeps his promises. But here's another thing that we can say about God being predictable is, well, the New Testament writers could pick up on the predictability of God. We see this, for one example, John in his letters, in his letter 1 John chapter 4, I think it is, where he says, God is love. God is so predictable in how he shows and demonstrates love that John is able to say, well, that's what God is. God is love. That's so much a part of God's character, is to love. So God is very predictable in that way. Now, what about us? What would people say about us? If John could say God is love, what would people say about Clark is, and then fill in the blank? Well, don't do that for me. Do that for yourself, and I should do that for myself too. What would people say about us? Would they say we're predictable in a bad way? Just like I could say God's people in the Old Testament were always rebellious, but God is love. What would people say about us? Would it be, are we predictable in a good way? Are there good things that people would fill in those blanks, that we've become predictable in a good way? If we're predictable in a good way, that will really help us face the unpredictable moments in life. As we're growing, for example, in character, God is love. That's really part of God's character. What about our character? Are we growing in the fruit of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, these kinds of things, kindness? Are we growing in these things? If we are, if we're predictably loving, if we're predictably joyful, if we're predictably gentle, these kinds of things, that's going to help us face unpredictable times. So are we predictable? But here's something else we want to say about Joseph, is that yes, he was predictable, but being predictable doesn't mean we're not full of surprises. Joseph was full of surprises. He would have surprised, for example, Potiphar's wife when she couldn't seduce him. She probably thought it was going to be an easy thing to do to seduce this Joseph guy, but it couldn't be done. Not at all. He would have been surprising to her in his integrity. Joseph would have been surprising then to the jailer, who just assumed he'd be like every other person in jail, who's probably grumpy to be there. But here is Joseph, just so helpful and so capable that the jailer basically puts him in charge of everything. And in this, Joseph would have been like a breath of fresh air in a very stale jail. He would have been a breath of fresh air there. That would have been surprising to everybody, but to the jailer who put him in charge. What about to Pharaoh? Joseph would have been surprising to Pharaoh too, in that would Pharaoh have ever expected that Egypt being saved from a coming drought, that would happen because of this foreigner who's stuck in jail? Usually, you can think of Pharaoh. Would Pharaoh ever learn about a foreigner stuck in a jail? Yet this one foreigner stuck in a jail, what a surprise. This should be the person that salvation should come to Egypt, that they could save up enough in the years of plenty so that they would be ready for the difficult years. What a surprise. And in this, again, Joseph is very much like God, who God is full of surprises. And one surprise we can think of with God, well, actually it's reflected in the Joseph stories. When we think of Joseph, there's a big surprise there from the beginning of the story to the end, where at the beginning, Joseph has this dream where the older brothers are going to bow down and worship him. And everybody's like, that is so not going to happen. Yet by the end of the story, surprise, here are the brothers bowing down before Joseph and also seeking salvation through Joseph. They need food. The family back home needs food. And so they have to go to Joseph to be saved from the trouble they're in. What a surprise that was happening. And that's a reflection of the surprising way that God used his people Israel. Because just as if Joseph was the younger brother and here's these older brothers kind of above him, the nation of Israel and Judah, these are tiny nations. When Babylon's this big, huge, powerful nation, Egypt is this big, huge, powerful nation, and here's Israel stuck in the middle. Here's God's people stuck in the middle. Who are these Israelites? There should be a people of no significance if you're a Babylonian or an Egyptian. And yet, it's prophesied throughout Scripture that all peoples will be coming to Jerusalem. All peoples will be seeking salvation through this people. And it's through this people comes Jesus Christ. And guess what? Jesus is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Surprise! Again, here we have this idea of this insignificant people in the eyes of the world, yet God should be doing something surprising, something hugely significant through this small people. What a surprise. And when God does come to us through Jesus Christ, again, Jesus, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, but surprise, no surprise, we act in a very predictable way as human beings, and we put him to death. Yet surprise, God offers reconciliation. God offers grace, mercy. God loves us. We put him to death. He loves us anyway and offers a relationship with us. Surprise. And yet also predictable, because after all, remember, God is love. And God made that promise way back to Abraham, I'll bless all the nations through you. That happens through Jesus Christ. Surprise, surprising way how it worked out, but very predictable too, because God is love. What about us? Is there anything surprising about us? Are we experienced as a breath of fresh air in people's lives? Does it ever happen that people, when they meet us, will think something like, well, anything I know about Christians, anything I know about Baptists perhaps, I've seen on the TV, and this is what I know about Christians and about Baptists, and I don't like them. But you, however, are a breath of fresh air somehow. There's something different about you. Is there something different about us? Is there something surprising about us? I don't know, if we're growing in character and in the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, gentleness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control, those kinds of things. If we're growing in that, I think we will be a breath of fresh air. People will find that we're surprising in many ways. Are we surprising people through our empathy? Are we surprising people through our compassion? Are we surprising people through our integrity? Is there something really different about us? Something surprising? And yet, are we predictable in a good way? Now, everything around us can be in change and in constant flux and totally unpredictable. But we have the opportunity, with God's help, to be a very predictable people through it all. And we look to God, who himself is predictable through it all. He is our rock. He is constant. We can have a similar kind of constancy, consistency, integrity. We can be growing in the fruit of the Spirit. And when our character is growing through God's work in us, God's work in us will show up in us even when everything is changing around us. And in that way, we'll be actually a breath of fresh air in our world. Will be surprising. But people will see that we're predictable in a good way. We could see that in Joseph. We can see that in Jesus Christ. We can see that in God, the Father. Do people see it in us? Facing constant change, life unpredictable, we can be predictable.